The morning Ida Carter rode onto Hugh Morgan's land, the sun was barely a whisper above the Caprock escarpment, and her canteen had been empty since before dawn. It was the summer of 1882, and the Texas Panhandle had turned itself into something close to a biblical punishment. The grass had gone the color of old straw. The creek beds that used to cut through the red earth in silver ribbons had dried to cracked mud and memory. Every rancher from the Canadian River down to the Caprock Rim was watching the sky with a kind of desperate faith that felt more like grief than hope. There had been no meaningful rain in 11 weeks. 11 weeks of baking, relentless, honest-to-God merciless heat that crept under your collar and lived there. Ida had ridden 4 miles from the small homestead she was trying, against considerable odds, to keep alive. The homestead had belonged to her husband, Dale Carter, until a rattlesnake found him in the south pasture 8 months ago. The snake had bitten him on the ankle, and Dale, being the sort of stubborn man who believed he could walk anything off, had done exactly that for 2 days before the poison finished what it had started. He was 31 years old when they buried him under the lone cottonwood near the fence line, and Ida had been 27. Now she was 28, a widow with 160 acres of sun-scorched scrub, 12 head of cattle, a horse named Clementine who was getting on in years, and a well that had gone dry as a preacher's humor 3 weeks past. She had heard from her neighbor Hattie Boone that Hugh Morgan's property sat over a good deep aquifer. Hugh Morgan's well never seemed to run low, not even in seasons like this one. Hattie had mentioned it without really meaning to. The way women mention things when they are talking about something else entirely, and Ida had turned the information over in her mind for days, before deciding that pride was a luxury she could not afford when her cattle were dying of thirst. So she had put on her best calico dress, the blue one that Dale had always said made her eyes look like still water, pulled her dark hair back under a wide-brimmed hat, and ridden Clementine 4 miles across cracked earth and shimmering heat to ask a stranger if she could draw water from his well. She did not know what Hugh Morgan was like. She had never met him. He had come to the Panhandle 2 years ago, bought up a stretch of land that most people said was too far from town to be worth the trouble, and had apparently proceeded to make something of it without making much noise about the fact. He did not come to the church socials in Clarendon. He was not seen at the feed store more than he needed to be. He paid his accounts on time, according to the store owner Walt Briggs, who had mentioned the man exactly once and in a tone of mild bewilderment, as if a man who paid his debts promptly and kept to himself was something slightly outside the natural order of things. The Morgan property announced itself first through the fence. It was a good fence, tight wire strung between posts that had been set properly into the ground, not leaning or rusted through. Then came the grass, which was not exactly green but was considerably less dead than everything Ida had ridden through. Someone had been managing the water carefully. She could see that right away. The cattle on this land were not the hollow-ribbed creatures she had seen on her own spread. They were lean but not suffering. Then she saw the house. It was not a grand house. It was a solid one. 2 stories of Texas limestone, squared and set with the kind of care that meant whoever built it had intended to stay. There was a wide front porch, and on that porch, sitting in a wooden chair with a coffee cup and what appeared to be a surveyor's map spread across his knees, was a man. He was watching her approach. He was somewhere around 30, she guessed, maybe a year or 2 one side or the other of that. He had the look of someone who worked outdoors and had made peace with what that did to a person's face and hands. His hair was dark and needed cutting. He had not shaved in a few days, and the stubble suited him in a way that struck her as vaguely unfair. He was wearing a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and when he stood as she rode into the yard, she saw that he was tall. Not in a showy way, just tall in the way that some men are, like the fact had not occurred to them to think about. He set his coffee cup on the porch railing and came down the steps, and he did not look annoyed or alarmed. He looked curious, and he was looking at her the way a person looks at something they were not expecting and cannot quite decide how to classify. She pulled Clementine up at the edge of the yard and cleared her throat. "I am looking for Hugh Morgan," she said. "You found him," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, even and unhurried. "My name is Ida Carter. I have the homestead about 4 miles east of here. The Hendricks place it was called before. My husband and I bought it 3 years ago." She paused. "My husband passed last fall." Something shifted in his expression, not pity exactly, something more respectful than that. "I am sorry to hear it." "Thank you." She gripped the reins a little tighter. "Mr. Morgan, I will not waste your time with a long approach. I have 12 head of cattle and my well has gone dry. I have been hauling water from a creek 3 miles north, but that creek is barely running now, and what is left of it is not fit for livestock. I have heard that your property sits over a good aquifer and your well is still producing. I have come to ask if I might have the right to draw water from your well until the rains come. I would be willing to pay for the use of it. I do not have much, but I could offer a portion of whatever my herd produces this fall, or labor if you have need of it, or I could offer to Mrs. Carter," Hugh Morgan said. She stopped talking. He was looking at her with an expression she could not read, and for one cold moment she thought he was going to send her away, and she was trying to decide what she would do after that, whether she would beg or whether she still had enough pride left to simply turn around and ride home. "You can have the water," he said. "You do not owe me anything for it." She blinked. "I beg your pardon. The water," he said again quietly. "You can have it. Drive your cattle over. Draw what you need. You do not have to pay me and you do not have to give me a portion of anything." He glanced toward the well at the side of the house, then back at her. "No good reason a neighbor should watch livestock die when there is enough water." She sat there on Clementine for a moment and did not say anything, because the relief that moved through her was so sudden and large that it knocked the words out of her. She had prepared for negotiation. She had prepared, in her worst imaginings on the ride over, for refusal. She had not prepared for simple, uncomplicated generosity. "That is very kind of you," she said at last, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. He nodded. "Stay and have some coffee if you like. The pot is fresh. We can talk about the practical side of it. What time of day works best for you to bring them over, how many at a time, things like that." She hesitated for only a moment. Her cattle were not in immediate danger that exact morning. Clementine could use a rest after the long ride. And there was something about the directness of his invitation, the absence of anything coy or calculated in it, that made her want to stay. She swung down from the saddle. He tied Clementine to the porch post and disappeared inside for a moment, and when he came back he had a second tin cup and he poured coffee into it from a blue enamelware pot that had seen considerable use. He handed it to her and gestured to the other chair on the porch, and they sat down, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and Ida found that the silence was not uncomfortable. "Your fence is well built," she said, because she meant it. "I did most of it myself," he said. "The first winter. You came here 2 years ago. Just about 2 years, from Colorado originally, before that Kansas." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I wanted land that was mine and land that had room in it." She looked out at the wide, flat reach of the Panhandle, the enormous sky, the red-brown earth running to the horizon. "There is certainly room." "That there is." He almost smiled, not quite, just the suggestion of one at the corner of his mouth. "Where are you from originally?" "Missouri," she said. "A little town called Fulton. My father had a farm there. I grew up knowing crops and seasons, but nothing like this." She gestured at the landscape. "This country does not much resemble Missouri." "What does it resemble?" she considered. "The moon, some days. On others it looks like something God made when he was feeling serious." He did smile then, fully. It changed his face quite a bit and she looked away quickly back at the horizon and took a sip of her coffee. "How long were you married?" he asked, and then immediately said, "I apologize, that is forward of me." "It is a reasonable question," she said. 2.5 years. We came out here together. Dale was from Texas, from Lubbock Way, and he wanted to try homesteading in the Panhandle. She paused. He was a hard worker. He believed in this land. You stayed on after. I did. That takes something, Hugh said, and there was no flattery in it, just the plain acknowledgement of a fact. It takes the absence of somewhere better to go, she said, and then laughed a little, a short sound. No, that is not entirely honest. I could have gone back to Missouri. My mother is still there, my sister, but I had put something into this place, into the soil, into those animals, and I thought. She stopped. What did you think? She looked at him directly for the first time since they had sat down. He was watching her with an attention that was not predatory but was very thorough, and she felt that he was actually listening, which was not as common a quality as people like to believe. I thought that if I left, I would be proving that it could not be done, by me or by someone like me. And I did not want that to be the proof I left behind. There was a pause. That is a fine reason, Hugh said, quietly and with conviction. They talked on the porch for another hour. She told him about the trouble with her cattle, the way 2 of them had gotten into a stretch of locoweed in the spring and had to be watched carefully, the ongoing problem of her fence along the southern pasture where the posts were rotting out and she could not afford to replace them all at once. He listened without offering unsolicited advice, which she found extraordinary. Dale had been a man who offered advice as a reflex, and while she had loved him for many things, that had not been one of them. Hugh talked about his own work on the property. He was running about 40 head mixed breed, and he had a hired hand who came out 3 days a week, a Mexican man named Raphael who was, according to Hugh, the best judge of cattle health he had ever encountered. He was also, Hugh mentioned in passing, trying to establish a small kitchen garden on the sheltered south side of the house, and the fact that the well had not run dry was the only reason the garden still existed. You should see it before you go, he said. She did. He walked her around the side of the house to a small enclosed area where tomatoes were going and some squash, and an ambitious row of beans that were doing better than they had any right to in this heat. There was a system of clay pipes and carved wooden channels that moved water from the well output to the base of the plants. She had never seen anything quite like it. You built this? She asked. Read about it, he said. In a book about agriculture in dry climates, figured it was worth trying. She looked at him sideways. A man who read about agriculture in dry climates and then actually built what he read about was not the sort of man you encountered with great frequency in the Texas Panhandle, or anywhere for that matter. It is very clever, she said. It is practical, he corrected, but not unkindly. She rode home that afternoon with the agreement settled. She would bring her cattle to his well in the early mornings, before the heat got serious, no more than 6 at a time so they did not overwhelm the water supply, and she would draw enough barrel water for her household use twice a week. Hugh Morgan would accept no payment. She thought about him the whole 4 miles back. She thought about the way he had said you can have the water as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. She thought about his garden and his book on dry climate agriculture. She thought about the way he listened. She told herself these were just observations, the kind any reasonable person would make about a neighbor they had just met. There was nothing more to it than that. The first morning she brought her cattle over, she expected to manage it herself and leave quickly, not wanting to be an imposition. But Hugh was already at the well when she arrived, and he had set up an extra watering trough so that 2 animals could drink at once, which cut her time in half. She thanked him and he waved it off, and while the cattle drank he asked about the locoweed situation and she told him, and they were deep in a conversation about managing cattle health with limited resources before she realized they had been talking for 40 minutes and she had not noticed the time passing at all. That was how it began, not with anything dramatic. Just with morning after morning where she arrived and he was there, and they talked while the cattle drank, and she left knowing something she had not known before, or feeling something she did not quite have a name for yet. He rode over to her property on the 3rd Saturday after their first meeting. She was trying to pull out a rotted fence post when she heard the horse and turned to see Hugh on a large roan, followed by a wagon loaded with fence posts. She stared at him. "I had a surplus," he said. "These were cut last fall and I never used them all. If you want them, I will help you set them." "Mr. Morgan," she began. "Hugh," he said. She looked at the posts, then at him. "Hugh, I cannot keep taking from you." He climbed down from the roan and tied him to the fence line. "You are not taking, I am offering." He pulled on his work gloves. "There is a difference. Now, which end of this fence line do you want to start from?" It took them the better part of the day. Working together, they replaced 11 posts along the south pasture, and Ida discovered that Hugh worked with a steady, focused efficiency that was deeply satisfying to be alongside. He did not make it a performance. He just worked. And somewhere around the 4th or 5th post, when they had established a rhythm of digging and setting and tamping, she started to feel comfortable enough to talk about things beyond the practical matter of fence posts. She told him about growing up in Fulton, about her mother's vegetable garden, and the summers that smelled like blackberries and warm earth. She told him about meeting Dale at a church social, which was such a cliché that she found herself laughing while she said it, and he smiled and said that clichés existed because they happened with some frequency. He told her about Colorado, about working on a cattle drive at 19, which had been both the hardest and the most formative thing he had done in his life, about his father, who had been a blacksmith in Kansas and who had died of influenza when Hugh was 24, about the fact that the land in the Panhandle had spoken to him, in a way he could not entirely explain to anyone who had not heard that particular kind of speaking. "It is like the land is still deciding what it wants to be," he said, driving a post into the reddish earth. "Most places I have been, the land has already made up its mind. Here it feels like the argument is still going on." She thought about that. "I felt that when Dale and I first came here, that we were arriving at something in progress. And now," she considered, "now it feels more like I am part of the argument myself." He looked at her then in that particular way he had, direct and unhurried. "That seems about right," he said. When they finished the last post and stood back to look at the line of solid, even, properly set fence, Ida felt something move through her that she recognized belatedly as pride. They had done something together, and it stood there in the ground as evidence. She made supper for them both that evening. There was not much to work with. She had flour and salt pork and some dried beans she had been stretching out, and she made cornbread in the iron skillet and a bean stew with what herbs she could find, and she put it on the table in the small kitchen of her stone and sod house, and Hugh Morgan sat across from her and ate it, and said it was the best meal he had eaten in recent memory. "You are being kind," she said. "I am being accurate," he said. "I eat my own cooking 6 days out of 7, and it is a grim business." She laughed. A real laugh, not the polite kind. It surprised her. He looked pleased by it. She thought about that look for longer than was probably wise after he had gone. 3 weeks into the arrangement, Raphael came by the Carter homestead on a Tuesday morning when Hugh was not with him. He introduced himself with considerable courtesy, and explained that Hugh had sent him to look at the 2 cattle that had gotten into the local weed, if Mrs. Carter did not mind. He looked them over with the practiced eye Hugh had described, and told her they were recovering well but that she should keep them separate from the rest of the herd for at least another 2 weeks, and that a certain combination of salt and dried molasses mixed into their feed would help. He showed her how to prepare it. When she thanked him and asked why Hugh had sent him, Raphael smiled. "He worries about your cattle," he said simply. She stood in the pasture after Raphael left and looked at her cattle and thought about Hugh Morgan worrying about them, and she did not know how to hold that feeling, so she set it aside and went back to work. The rain still did not come. August settled over the Panhandle like a weight. The sky went white with heat by mid-morning and stayed that way until sundown. Ida continued her early morning trips to Hugh's well with the cattle, and Hugh continued to be there, and they continued to talk. She began to bring things. A jar of the blackberry preserves she had made from the last of the berries she had found growing along a dry creek bed. Cornbread. Once, a small pie made from the dried apples she had been keeping in the root cellar, sweetened with a little molasses because she had no sugar to spare. He received all of these with an expression of genuine appreciation that was entirely free of condescension. He never said anything like "you did not need to do that." He just said thank you and meant it. He, in return, sent things back with her. A portion of fresh beef when he butchered one of his steers, wrapped in paper. A jar of honey from the half-wild bees he had found making a home in one of his fence posts. And one afternoon, a book. It was left on the well's edge when she arrived one morning with a small note that said simply, "Thought you might enjoy this." It was a novel she had not read, and she brought it home and read it at night by lamplight when the heat had not entirely broken, and she thought about him choosing it and thought about whether that was the kind of thing a man did when he was simply being neighborly. She could not decide. In the second week of August, Hugh rode over in the late afternoon with a question. He had been thinking, he said, about her cattle. Her 12 head were not enough for her operation to be sustainable long-term, not with the losses she had already had. He knew a man in Clarendon who had a small herd he was looking to sell at a fair price because he was moving his family east. Would she be willing to go and look at them with him the following Saturday? She studied him. "Why are you so interested in the sustainability of my operation, Hugh?" The question landed between them and stayed there. He did not look away. "Because you are someone who should not fail," he said, and the simplicity of it was so complete that it was almost startling. "And because I have learned enough about your situation to know that you are doing everything right and simply need a few things to go right in return." She looked at the dry ground for a moment. Then she looked back at him. "All right," she said. "Saturday, then." They rode to Clarendon together, which was a 7-mile ride, and the town when they arrived was as dusty and sun-bleached as everything else, but it had the particular energy of a place that was growing anyway, that was choosing growth over the discouragement of the conditions. There was a new building going up on the main street. The church had a fresh coat of paint. The man selling the cattle was named Horace Webb, and he had 8 young steers that were in good condition despite the drought, because Horace Webb was a careful man who had been in this business a long time. Hugh looked at every one of them with a thoroughness that impressed even Horace. Ida watched him run his hands along their backs and flanks, check their hooves and teeth, assess their condition with the same quiet, methodical attention he gave everything. He looked at her. 3 of them are excellent, the other 5 are good. Any of the 3 would be worth more than Horace is asking. "You know cattle," Horace said to Hugh, with the appreciation of one professional for another. "A little," Hugh said. They ended up negotiating, and Ida got the 3 best steers for a price that was genuinely fair, and Hugh helped her arrange for them to be delivered the following week. On the ride back, the sun was going orange and the shadows were long across the flat land, and it was the first moment in months that Ida had felt something other than the grinding anxiety of daily survival. She felt cautiously like something was beginning to look up. She told Hugh so. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "It has been good. These past weeks." He said it as if he were discovering the words as he spoke them, trying their weight. "Getting to know you." She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "For me as well," she said. The horses walked on. The sky went from orange to the deep rose and violet that this particular stretch of sky did at evening better than anywhere else she had ever seen it. "Ida," he said. She looked over at him. He was looking at her, and there was something in his face that she had been seeing for weeks and naming as something careful and neighborly and decent, and she realized now that she had been incorrect in her naming of it. "I would like to call on you," he said, "properly, if you are amenable." She felt her heart do something sudden and irregular that she considered unprofessional behavior on the part of an organ whose job was to be steady. "I am a widow," she said, not as a refusal, as a statement of complexity. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to forget anything or replace anything. I would just like to spend time with you in a way that has an honest name." She thought about honest names and about the last weeks and about the water and the fence posts and the book and the honey, and she thought about the way he listened and the way he worked and the way he had looked when she laughed. "Yes," she said, "I am amenable." He nodded, and something in his whole bearing relaxed just slightly, and she realized he had been holding a tension that he had been hiding from her, and that underneath his quiet certainty there had been the same uncertainty that was moving through her, and that knowledge made her feel closer to him than anything else that had been said. The rains came at last in the second week of September. They came the way rains came in the Panhandle when they finally decided to show up, with a force and generosity that bordered on theatrical. The dry creek beds filled. The grass began to revive. The sky, which had been a scorching white for months, went back to the particular blue-gray that meant weather. Ida stood on her porch in the rain and lifted her face to it and felt something release in her chest that had been clenched since spring. Hugh rode over that afternoon through the rain, his hat dark with wet, and when he saw her standing on the porch, he pulled up his horse and sat there grinning, and she was grinning back, and it was ridiculous how happy both of them were about precipitation. "It rained," he said. "It did," she agreed. He swung down from his horse and came up onto the porch and stood next to her, and they watched the rain move across the land in gray curtains, bending the revived grass, filling the tracks in the red earth. "You will not need my well now," he said. "No," she said, and then, because it was true and because she was learning that the best things were said plainly, "I will still need to see you." He looked down at her, and the expression on his face was something she wanted to remember for the rest of her life. "That is good," he said, "because I had no intention of stopping." He stayed for supper that evening, and afterward they sat on the porch and listened to the rain on the roof, and he asked about her family in Missouri, and she asked about his time in Colorado, and somewhere in the middle of the evening, he reached over and took her hand and held it, and she let him. And they sat like that while the rain eased and the stars appeared and the night smelled like wet earth and the possibility of everything that follows a drought. He called on her properly every Sunday after that, riding over in the late morning and staying through the afternoon. He met Hattie Boone, her neighbor, who came by one Sunday in October and spent the better part of an hour assessing Hugh with the professional eye of a woman who had raised 4 daughters and knew everything about what a man's intentions were based on how he drank his coffee. After Hugh left that day, Hattie said to Ida, "He watches you when you are not looking." "People look at things," Ida said. "Not like that," Hattie said, and helped herself to more coffee. It was on a Sunday in late October that Hugh brought her something she was not expecting. It was a letter, written on good paper, in careful handwriting. He handed it to her on the porch without explanation, and she opened it. It was from a land rights attorney in Amarillo, and it detailed the formal transfer of water rights from the Morgan Aquifer to include shared usage with the Carter property, properly documented and registered with the county. She looked up at him. "You did this," she said. "In case we ever have another summer like this one," he said. "It is yours now. Legally, you do not have to come and ask. You do not have to worry." She sat with the letter in her hands for a moment and thought about the morning she had ridden over here in her best calico dress with an empty canteen, ready to beg if she had to. She thought about what it had cost her in pride even to make that ride. And now here was this man who had given her the water before she had even finished asking, telling her that it was hers and always would be by law. "Hugh," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "It is just a practical matter," he said, and she knew him well enough by now to hear what lived underneath his practical matters. "No," she said, "it is not just a practical matter." He looked at her, and she stood up from the porch chair and crossed the small distance between them and kissed him on the cheek. And when she drew back, he was very still, and then he turned his face so that he was looking right at her, so close she could see the exact shade of his dark eyes. "Ida," he said, and his voice was quiet and low and certain. "Yes," she said, though he had not asked anything yet, and he kissed her, properly, gently, with the same careful steadiness he brought to everything he did, and it was so different from anything she had expected that she forgot for a moment how to think. They were standing on her porch in the October afternoon, and the Panhandle was greening up from the September rains, and her cattle were fat and her fence was mended, and her well had been dry once, and now everything was different. When they drew apart, he rested his forehead against hers, and they were both very still. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since the morning you told me you stayed because you did not want to leave proof that it could not be done." She considered this. "That was a long time ago." "August," he said, "so about 3 months. You waited 3 months. You were recently widowed and I was trying to be decent." She laughed against his shoulder. "You are the most deliberately decent man I have ever met. I thought I was being practical. You were being decent. There is a difference." She repeated his own words back at him, and felt him smile against her hair. November arrived and brought the first cold, which in the Panhandle meant a serious wind that cut through anything inadequate. Hugh helped her weatherize her house, stuffing gaps in the stonework and checking the roof, and she told him he was going to wear himself out helping her with her problems. "Then you should let me take on some of your problems permanently," he said, and he said it lightly, but he was watching her with a carefulness that let her know it was not entirely a light thing. She met his eyes. "Is that a practical suggestion?" "It might be more than that," he said. She thought about it. Not for long, because she had been thinking about it in one form or another since September, maybe longer. She thought about what it meant to love someone again. She thought about Dale, who was in the ground under the cottonwood, and she thought about the fact that loving Hugh was not the same as forgetting Dale, and that she had the capacity to hold both those truths in herself without one canceling the other. She thought about the well and the fence posts and the book and the honey and 3 months of Sunday afternoons, and a man who had said you can have the water before she had even finished the sentence. "More than a practical suggestion would suit me," she said. He took a breath. Then he did what Hugh Morgan did, which was cut straight to the honest thing without embellishment. "Will you marry me, Ida?" "Yes," she said, without a single hesitation, and meant it completely. They were married in December in the Clarendon church that had been freshly painted, with Hattie Boone in the front pew wearing her good hat and looking profoundly smug in the manner of a woman whose judgment has been vindicated. Raphael was there and looked genuinely moved. A few other neighbors from the area came, and the minister was a serious young man from Ohio who was still getting used to the landscape, but performed the ceremony with appropriate solemnity. Ida wore the blue calico dress because she had nothing better, and because it had, as it turned out, done its job. Hugh wore a clean dark jacket that he had apparently owned for years for exactly such an occasion, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her walk down the aisle with an expression that she would later describe to her mother in a letter as the way a man looks when he cannot quite believe his own luck, which was the most romantic thing she had ever written down, and which she was somewhat embarrassed about, but which was entirely accurate. They said the words to each other in front of everyone, and she meant every single one of them, and she could see that he did too. After the ceremony, Hattie organized a wedding supper in the church hall, and there was considerable food considering the year they had all just had, and someone produced a fiddle and then another fiddle, and the evening went long and warm and loud in the way that good evenings in small communities go, where everyone knows everyone else, and the occasion matters to all of them. Hugh danced with her, badly but enthusiastically, and she told him he had no natural talent for it, and he agreed entirely, and they kept dancing anyway. They went home that night to the Morgan house, which was now her house too, and it felt like stepping into something that had been waiting for her without her knowing it was waiting. She stood in the kitchen of the limestone house and looked at the blue enamelware coffee pot on the stove, and felt the particular peace of being exactly where you are supposed to be. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold in the Panhandle, but not the worst kind of cold. Hugh had put up enough hay to see the combined herd through, and the herd was combined now, Her 12 head and his 40 turned into one operation on the Morgan land. She had not sold her homestead. They kept it, renting the grazing rights to a family that had come up from South Texas and needed land while they got established, and the rental income was modest but useful. She wrote to her mother in Missouri and told her everything, and her mother wrote back with a thoroughness that was both touching and exhausting, asking approximately 40 questions about Hugh's character, his faith, his finances, his family history, and whether he was kind to animals. Ida answered all 40 questions as honestly as she could and received in return a letter that said, "He sounds like a good man. You always did know a good man when you found one." That last line made Ida cry a little, and she was not sure entirely why, except that it had to do with Dale and with the way love was not a finite thing that got used up. Hugh found her with the letter and asked with some alarm if everything was all right, and she showed him the line and he read it and nodded and said, "Your mother sounds like a sensible woman." Then he put his arm around her and they stood in the kitchen together reading the letter. In February, Hugh rode to Clarendon for supplies and came back with a crate of books he had ordered from a catalog, and when Ida unpacked them, she found that most of them were for her. She looked up at him across the unpacked crate. "You bought books for me," she said. "I bought some for both of us," he said, "but the novels are yours. I'm a slow reader of novels. You are a fast reader of agriculture texts. That is different. Those are about things I need to know. Novels are also about things you need to know," she said. He considered this. "Tell me one thing you have learned from a novel that I could not have learned anywhere else." She thought about it carefully because she took the question seriously. "That the inside of another person's experience is entirely real and entirely beyond you at the same time," she said. "And that reading is the closest anyone gets to crossing that distance." He looked at her for a long moment. "I would read more novels," he said, "if you would explain them to me afterward." It became a habit over the following months that she read and then told him about what she had read, and he listened with his full attention, and sometimes they argued about what a character had done and why, and those arguments were some of the most enjoyable conversations she had ever had. Spring came to the Panhandle in 1883 with more generosity than 1882 had shown. The rains came earlier and more regularly. The grass came in thick, and the water table rose. The Morgan well, which had never run dry anyway, was abundant. The Carter homestead that they rented to the South Texas family was producing well enough that the family was talking about buying it outright, which would give Ida and Hugh a solid sum to reinvest in their operation. The combined herd had grown. With the 3 steers she had bought in Clarendon, and the new calves that spring, and the careful management that Hugh applied to everything he did, they were running close to 60 head by May, which was a real operation, the kind that could sustain itself and more. One morning in late April, Ida was at the kitchen garden, which she had expanded considerably over the winter, adding more beds and improving the clay pipe water system with a few modifications she had worked out herself. She was on her knees in the good red earth when she realized that she felt strange, and had been feeling strange for about 2 weeks, and that the strangeness had a particular quality that she recognized from a conversation she had once had with Hattie Boone about a specific kind of female circumstance. She sat back on her heels and looked at the tomato seedlings and did a calculation in her head. She went and found Hugh at the corral where he was working with Raphael on sorting the new calves, and she said, "Hugh, can I speak with you a moment?" He handed his rope to Raphael and came over. She looked at him. He looked at her. He had always been good at reading her, and something in her face told him that this was not an ordinary moment. "What is it?" he asked very quietly. "I believe we are going to need to make some additions to the house," she said. He was still for a moment. Then, "Ida. By November, I think, give or take." He crossed the small space between them and took her face in both his hands and looked at her with an expression that she had no words for and did not need any. He kissed her forehead and her cheek and then held her against him, and she could feel his heartbeat going faster than usual. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I am fine," she said. "I'm better than fine, I am just telling you." "A baby," he said, as if testing the word. "That is generally what it is," she agreed. He laughed, and it was the fullest laugh she had ever heard from him, and she felt it in her chest. Raphael, across the corral, glanced over and saw Hugh Morgan standing in the yard holding his wife and laughing, and he nodded to himself in the satisfied way of a man who has seen things go correctly for people who deserved it. The summer of 1883 was everything that the summer of 1882 had not been. Rain came regularly. The grass stayed green. The water table held. Ida's garden produced more than they could eat, and she dried and preserved what she could not, and sent portions of it to Hattie Boone, who was managing alone since her youngest had gone to Amarillo to apprentice with a printer. Hattie came over often in those summer months, and she and Ida sat on the porch in the evenings and talked about everything and nothing in the particular way of women who have been friends long enough to be honest, and Hattie told Ida things about the pregnancy and about what to expect that no book would have told her, and that she was grateful for. Hugh was attentive without being smothering, which she appreciated enormously. He continued to let her do her work, because she wanted to and because she was capable, while also watching for things she would not necessarily notice herself. He rearranged the bedroom to make it more comfortable without being asked. He learned to make a decent bean soup, which was no small accomplishment because his cooking really was as grim as he had claimed. She caught him reading one of the novels one evening in late July, the one about a woman who crosses the frontier alone. He was deep in it and did not hear her come into the room, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him, and felt such a specific tenderness that she had to look away. He looked up and saw her and said, "You were right about novels." "What did you learn?" she asked. He looked back at the book for a moment. "That a person can carry a great deal and still be going somewhere," he said. She sat down next to him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder, and that was an entire evening, and it was one of the best ones she could remember. In September, her mother arrived from Missouri. This was the result of an exchange of letters that had been building for months, and it was something Ida had not been entirely sure how to feel about until the buckboard pulled up in the yard and her mother, a small solid woman named Agnes Carter who was 61 years old and had opinions about most things, climbed down from it and looked at the limestone house and said, "Well, it is a substantial house." "That was your opening thought," Ida said. Agnes turned and looked at her daughter, and her expression went soft in a way that only happened around people she truly loved. "My opening thought," she said, "was that you look healthy and happy, and that is more than I hoped for when I got on that train." They embraced there in the yard, and Ida found herself unexpectedly emotional, which she attributed to her current condition, but which was also just the fact of her mother being here, in this place, which had cost her so much and given her so much. Hugh came out of the house, and Agnes looked him over with the thoroughness she had applied to everything Ida had told her in the letters, and Hugh stood and received this assessment with the same patient steadiness he gave everything. "Mr. Morgan," Agnes said. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "Welcome to Texas." Agnes sniffed. "It is very flat." "Yes, ma'am, most of it. My daughter says your cattle are doing well." "They are. And the garden." "Ida built most of the garden." Agnes looked at Ida. Then back at Hugh. "My daughter's letter said that you read." Hugh blinked, slightly surprised by the direction of the conversation. "I do, yes." "What are you reading at present?" "A book on soil management in semi-arid climates," he said, "and a novel about the frontier that Ida gave me." Agnes appeared to weigh this. Then she said, "Good, a man who reads is a man who thinks," and she walked up the porch steps into the house, indicating clearly that the assessment was complete and had gone favorably. Hugh looked at Ida. "Ida said she likes you." "How can you tell?" "She did not ask your opinion about anything." He considered this. "Is that good?" "She only asks the opinions of people she does not trust. She already decided you were trustworthy." He looked slightly bewildered in the way of a man whose experience has not previously included Agnes Carter, and Ida patted his arm and went inside. Agnes stayed for 6 weeks. She was, as she had always been, simultaneously difficult and irreplaceable. She had views on the kitchen layout, the state of the curtains, the quality of the cornmeal, the best way to manage morning sickness when it struck in the afternoons, and the correct angle at which to hang a laundry line. But she also knew exactly how to plait hair when your hands were swollen, and how to make a broth that settled a difficult stomach. And she sat with Ida in the evenings and told her things about her own pregnancies, and about what childbirth was, and about what to expect, in plain and honest language that Ida needed to hear. Agnes also took to watching Hugh the way she watched anything she had decided she approved of, which meant with a quiet and ongoing attention. She watched him at supper and in the yard, and she watched the way he spoke to Ida and the way he listened to Ida. And one evening when Ida was resting and Agnes and Hugh were sitting on the porch with their coffee, Agnes said, "She was not well for a long time after Dale. She did not say so in the letters, but I knew." Hugh was quiet. "She is well now," Agnes said. "It was not a question." "I believe so," Hugh said. "I hope so. You have been good for her." "She would have managed without me," he said, and meant it. Agnes looked at him with considerable approval. "Yes, she would have, but managing is not the same as thriving. You understand the difference." "I am learning," he said. Agnes nodded. "That is the right answer." She left in mid-October, on a buckboard to Clarendon and then the train east, and when she went she held Ida for a long moment and said into her hair, "He is a good man. You chose well." And Ida thought again about the letter her mother had written and the thing she had said about always knowing a good man, and she held on a little longer. Hugh stood at the fence and watched the buckboard until it was dust on the road. And then he came and stood next to Ida and said nothing, only put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they went back inside together. On the 10th of November, 1883, in the stone and limestone house on the Morgan property in the Texas Panhandle, with Hattie Boone and a midwife from Clarendon, named Mrs. Pryor, in attendance, Ida Carter Morgan gave birth to a boy. He was large and healthy and loud, which Mrs. Pryor said were the three best things a newborn could be. He had dark hair like his father and eyes that were, in the first days, impossible to read, but which over the following weeks resolved into something that was clearly Ida's particular shade of blue-gray. Hugh held his son for the first time with the careful precision of a man holding the most fragile and important thing he had ever been trusted with, and his face did something that Ida, watching from the bed, could not entirely describe, except that it was the same quality of feeling she had seen on their wedding day, only larger. They named him James Dale Morgan, the middle name for Dale Carter, who was under the cottonwood tree 4 miles east, and who deserved to be remembered by the woman who had loved him and the life she was now living. Hugh did not ask about the middle name. He had suggested it himself, quietly, one evening in September when they were talking about names. "Your first husband gave you this life," he had said. "He brought you to this land, that matters." She had looked at him for a long time after that. "That is a generous thing," she said. "It is a true thing," he said. James Dale Morgan entered the world with a serious expression that made Mrs. Pryor laugh and say he looked like he had opinions already, which turned out to be accurate. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was spent in a kind of domestic fullness that Ida had not anticipated, and which turned out to be one of the great pleasures of her life. The baby was demanding in the honest, uncomplicated way of babies, wanting food and warmth and the sound of a familiar voice, and Hugh provided all of these things with the same steady reliability he gave everything. He got up in the night without being asked. He learned to hold James in the particular way that settled him, walking slow circles in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, and Ida would sometimes hear them from the bedroom, the creak of Hugh's boots and the diminishing complaints of their son, and she would close her eyes in the dark and feel something so complete and full that it almost hurt. Spring came again. James grew. The herd grew. The South Texas family who had been renting the Carter homestead made an offer to buy it in March of 1884, and after much discussion, Ida and Hugh accepted. The sum was fair, and it allowed them to pay off the remaining note on the Morgan property entirely, and to invest in improvements they had been planning, including a second water tank and the expansion of the barn. Raphael, who had worked part-time for Hugh since the beginning, came on full-time that spring and brought with him his younger brother Tomas, who was 19 and eager and good with horses in the way some people are born into. The Morgan operation was no longer a one-man enterprise fighting the conditions. It was a real working ranch with plans and a future and people who depended on it. In the summer of 1884, a drought notice went out from the county, warning of another dry season developing. Ida read the notice at the supper table and looked up at Hugh. "The well will be fine," he said immediately. "I know," she said, "and the new tank will help. I know that too. I am just saying," she smiled at him. "I know you are. I was just thinking that 2 summers ago I rode over here on Clementine in a blue calico dress to ask a stranger for water." He looked at her across the supper table, where James was attempting to eat cornbread with the determination of a person who has recently discovered that hands are useful tools. "And now," Hugh said. "And now," she agreed. He reached across the table and took her hand, and James looked at both of them with the bright and wholly uncritical attention of a child who has never known a world where these two people were not together, who has no frame of reference for the droughts and distances and graves and long rides that preceded him, and who is therefore entirely correct that this is simply the way things are and always will be. The summer was dry but not as bad as 1882. The new tank helped. The well held. They sent water to the south, to 2 families who were struggling, doing for others what Hugh had done for Ida, because that was the kind of thing you did when you had enough and others did not. Hattie Boone came to supper every Sunday now, because her youngest had come back from Amarillo and started a family of his own in Clarendon, and she was alone in a way she was still adjusting to. And Ida and Hugh had simply made Sunday suppers include Hattie as a matter of course, the way you include the obvious things. Raphael and Tomas had a small bunkhouse now, built that spring, and on weekend evenings there was sometimes guitar music from that direction, and it drifted across the yard in the warm dark and mixed with the sounds of the cattle and the wind, and Ida thought that this was what it sounded like when a place was alive. In August of 1884, something happened that Ida had not been expecting, which was that a man appeared at their gate on a lathered horse, claiming to represent a land investment company out of Denver. He had papers, he said, and an offer. The company was interested in acquiring large tracts of Panhandle land for commercial cattle operation, and the Morgan property, being well-watered and well-managed, was exactly the sort of parcel they were seeking. Hugh heard the man out with complete patience and then said no. The man increased the offer. Hugh said no again, pleasantly. The man said it was a great deal of money. Hugh said he was sure it was and that the answer was still no. After the man left, Ida came out onto the porch where Hugh was standing watching the dust of the departing horse settle. "He was offering quite a lot," she said. "Yes," Hugh said. "And you said no." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her, and then at the land around them, the good limestone house and the green grass yard and the barn and the new tank and the bunkhouse and the garden that Ida had built, with its careful clay pipes moving water to the roots of things. "Because this is not for sale," he said. "Not any of it." She looked at the same things he was looking at. She thought about what this land had cost, in sweat and grief and drought and stubbornness. She thought about Dale under the cottonwood. She thought about an early morning in July of 1882, riding Clementine with an empty canteen and her pride held in her hands like something that might break. "No," she agreed. "It is not." They stood on the porch in the August evening, and the land ran out around them in all directions toward the big sky, and the Panhandle was doing what it always did, which was being enormous and indifferent and beautiful in its indifference, and the two of them stood in the middle of it and were not indifferent to any of it at all. The following spring, 1885, Ida discovered that James was going to have company. She told Hugh in the kitchen garden, kneeling in the dirt, and he sat down right there in the garden row next to her, which was not his usual way of handling news, and she looked at him sitting in the dirt among her tomato plants. "You sat down," she observed. "I was surprised," he said. "You knew this was a possibility." "Yes," he said, "but each time it is a surprise." He helped her up and held her hands and looked at her with that expression she had learned to read, the one that was quiet on the surface and full of everything underneath. "Are you pleased?" she asked. "Ida," he said, and pulled her close and held her there in the garden in the spring morning with the smell of new earth and growing things around them. "Yes." James Dale Morgan was a year and a half old, and conducting a rigorous investigation of the fence post nearest the garden gate when his sister was born in November of 1885. She was smaller than James had been, and quieter, and she had Hugh's dark hair, and it emerged over the following weeks, the particular quality of his gaze, steady and unhurried and taking everything in. They named her Agnes Ruth Morgan for Ida's mother and for Hugh's, and when the news reached Missouri, Agnes Carter wrote back a letter that was, for once, brief. It said only, "I will be on the next train that makes sense. Your father's pocket watch is going to James when he is old enough, and I am bringing it myself." Agnes arrived in December, and she brought the pocket watch, which had been Ida's father's originally, and which Hugh put away carefully in the cedar box in the bedroom for the day when James was old enough to understand what it meant to carry something that had traveled all that distance and all that time to reach him. Agnes stayed through Christmas, and the house was full in the way that good houses get full, with people and noise and cooking smells, and the sound of a child being delighted by everything around him, and a baby being carefully introduced to the world. Hugh cooked Christmas dinner himself, with considerable help from Ida and supervision from Agnes, who had standards, and the result was actually excellent, which surprised everyone including Hugh. Raphael and Tomas were invited, and they came, and brought tamales that Tomas's mother had sent from San Antonio, and the meal was a combination of things that should not necessarily have fit together but did. Hattie Boone sat at the end of the table and looked around at all of it with the expression of a woman who has been correctly smug for 3 years and has no intention of stopping. Agnes, sitting across from Hugh, watched her daughter and her son-in-law move through the kitchen together, the small, efficient way they navigated the same space, the fact that they could have an entire conversation in the kitchen with only glances and small movements, the way Hugh handed Ida things she was about to need before she asked for them. "You pay attention," Agnes said to Hugh at a quiet moment. "I try to," he said. "It is the most important thing," Agnes said. "In all of it, that and showing up." "I learned both late," he said. Agnes studied him. "You learned them, that is what counts." She left on New Year's Day, heading back to Missouri with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has examined a situation thoroughly and found it to be sound. She held both grandchildren on the porch in the cold morning before the buckboard came, and held Ida, and shook Hugh's hand, which was, Ida knew, her mother's version of an embrace. The years passed with the particular quality of years that are full of good things and normal troubles, the kind that test without breaking. James grew into a boy who was serious about cattle and could identify 12 different grasses by the time he was 6, who had Hugh's patience and Ida's stubbornness in equal measure, which made him a formidable person to argue with on any subject. He followed Hugh around the ranch from the time he could walk, learning by proximity, and Hugh answered every question completely, because he did not believe in partial answers to honest questions. Agnes Ruth, who by general consensus became Ruth rather than Agnes to avoid confusion with her grandmother, was quieter than her brother and more observant. She noticed things before other people noticed them, and she had a way of stating what she had noticed with such matter-of-fact directness that it occasionally stopped people cold. She was going to be, Ida felt with certainty, formidable in her own particular way. The ranch continued to grow, By 1887, they were running nearly 100 head, which required full-time management and more hands than just Raphael and Tomas. 2 more men were hired, brothers from the Comanche area named Eli and Jonas, who were solid workers and good horsemen, and the Morgan operation was known in the county by then as one of the better-run outfits in the Panhandle. The question of the injustices of the territory was not an abstract one. The Comanche people who had been in this land for generations had been forced onto reservation land in Oklahoma by the late 1870s, and the land that Ida and Hugh and their neighbors ranched had been that homeland. Hugh spoke of this plainly when it came up, which it did, because you could not honestly talk about the Panhandle without it. He did not know how to undo what had been done. He knew how to acknowledge it, which was at least the beginning of something honest. He treated Eli and Jonas and Raphael and Tomas not as lesser men doing him a favor by working for him, but as men doing a job that deserved fair pay and fair treatment, which was not universally the practice in the Panhandle, and which Eli, who had worked elsewhere, noted with a kind of quiet gratitude. Hugh did not make anything of it. He simply did not see the sense in doing otherwise. In 1888, Ida's mother Agnes became ill, and the letter that arrived from Fulton was written by Ida's sister Clara, who was asking gently whether Ida could come. Ida and Hugh talked it through at the kitchen table that evening. She needed to go. The children were too young for the journey, and it would be winter travel, difficult and long. Hugh could not leave the ranch for that length of time. The solution was hard but clear. "I will go alone," Ida said. "I know," Hugh said. "I do not like it." "I know," she said. "How long?" "I do not know, as long as she needs." He nodded and reached across the table and took her hand. She left in the first week of December, on the train from Clarendon to Fort Worth, and then the long route north and east to Missouri. She was gone for 9 weeks, and they were the hardest 9 weeks Hugh had experienced since before he had known her, because the house that had become full with her was very quiet without her, and the children missed her in the specific and unguarded way of children who do not yet know how to hide their feelings. He wrote to her every week. Plain letters about the ranch and the children and the small daily things, and in each letter he found 1 or 2 sentences that were not about any of those things but were about her, and about the specific quality of her absence, and she kept all of those letters in a tin box in her mother's spare room and read them on the difficult nights. Agnes Carter died in late January of 1889, quietly, with Ida and Clara beside her. She had been, for most of her life, a practical woman who valued plain speech and good work and did not make a great show of sentiment, but in her last weeks she had become tender in a way that Ida found both heartbreaking and precious. She talked about Ida's father, who had died years before. She talked about the grandchildren, asking questions about James and Ruth with a delight that was entirely undisguised. She held Ida's hand and said, "You built something real out there. I am proud of you, Ida. I always was." She was buried in the Fulton Church Cemetery next to Ida's father in the cold Missouri January, and Ida stood at the grave in the gray morning and felt the grief move through her like weather, hard and then passing, leaving the air washed. She was back in Texas by the middle of February. Hugh met her at the Clarendon station with both children and the wagon, and when she came off the train platform, James ran at her full force, and Ruth, who was 3, held up her arms and said simply, "Mama," with such absolute certainty that Ida had to hold both of them for a long time before she could look up. Hugh was standing a little back, letting her have the moment with the children. When she finally stood, holding Ruth on her hip, she looked at him. He had the look of someone who has been managing very hard things very steadily and is now allowing himself to stop managing. She crossed to him and put her free arm around him, and he held her and Ruth both, and James attached himself to the side of the embrace because he was not willing to be left out. They stood on the Clarendon station platform in February of 1889 in a knot of themselves, and it was cold and windy, and the train was departing behind them in a cloud of steam, and none of them said anything for a while. "Let us go home," Ida said at last. Hugh loaded her trunk into the wagon and handed her up onto the seat, and James climbed up next to her with the self-important efficiency of a boy who has been, in her absence, conducting himself with considerable seriousness, and Ruth settled into her lap, and Hugh took the reins, and they drove out of Clarendon and back across the flat and beautiful land toward the limestone house and the well that never ran dry. She was 34 years old. He was 37. They had been married 6 years, and the life they had built in those 6 years was something she could see whole now, as if her absence had given her the distance necessary to see the shape of it. She looked at the side of his face as he drove. He felt her looking and glanced over. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I am just looking." The spring of 1889 came in warm and wet, and the pastures went green and stayed green, and the cattle were fat and healthy. James turned 6 and was given, with ceremony, his first real responsibility on the ranch, which was the morning feeding of the horses, and he took this so seriously that he began waking before his father to ensure it was done properly. Ruth turned 4 and made it known that she intended to have a horse of her own, and the negotiation around this was ongoing. In May of 1889, on a clear afternoon when the Panhandle was being completely itself, enormous and open and blazing with light, Ida was in the garden when Hugh came and found her. He stood at the garden gate and looked at her among her plants, and she straightened and looked back at him. "What is it?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to see where you were." She studied him. "You rode over from the north pasture to see where I was." "Yes, Hugh. I sometimes just want to know where you are," he said. "I do not think that requires an explanation." She looked at him standing at her garden gate in the May afternoon, weathered and solid in hers, this man who had said you can have the water before she had even finished asking, who had driven fence posts into the hard earth of her south pasture, who had chosen her middle name for their daughter, who had written her plain letters with sentences in them that were not plain at all, who had met her at the Clarendon station and held her and their daughter and not said anything because nothing needed to be said. She crossed the garden and kissed him at the gate, which was not a thing she had done before in plain daylight where anyone could see, and she heard him laugh quietly in surprise. "All right," he said when she drew back. "I sometimes want to do that," she said. "I do not think that requires an explanation." He was smiling, the full smile that had always changed his face considerably, and he put his arm around her and they stood at the garden gate and looked at the spring afternoon around them, the green grass and the big sky and the cattle moving in the distance and the good limestone house with its wide porch where they had sat that first morning and talked while her cattle drank. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me when you offered to let me use the well? You said you could not see any good reason a neighbor should watch livestock die when there was enough water." "I remember," he said. "I thought you were the most direct man I had ever met." "Is that good?" "I have decided it is," she said, consistently. He looked down at her. "What else did you need that morning beyond the water?" She thought about it honestly. "Someone to believe that it could work," she said, "that the whole thing could work. Someone who saw what I was doing and thought it had a chance." "It always had a chance," he said. "I needed someone else to think so." "I thought so," he said quietly, "from the beginning." She leaned against his shoulder. "I know," she said. "That is why I stayed to talk." The afternoon went on around them, warm and wide, and full of the particular piece of a life that has been built with intention and survived what it needed to survive. James was somewhere in the direction of the barn, doing his horse feeding with the thoroughness of a 6-year-old who has been given a responsibility and intends to honor it. Ruth was in the house taking a nap, or was supposed to be, though the likelihood of actual sleep was, based on recent history, approximately even. Raphael was singing something in the bunkhouse, a habit that had been going on for 3 years and which had become part of the sound of the place. The garden was growing. The well was full. The cattle were fine. Everything was fine. more than fine. It was the specific and hard one and real kind of good that comes not from luck but from surviving the things that tried to prevent it, from choosing to stay when you could have left, from riding 4 miles in the summer heat with an empty canteen and enough pride and enough need to ask for help. Ida Carter had ridden onto Hugh Morgan's land to ask about the well rights, and he had told her she could have the water. And then he had told her to stay and talk. And she had stayed and talked, and she had kept coming back morning after morning, and neither of them had stopped. James Morgan was 16 when he took over the morning cattle check from his father on a permanent basis, riding the fence lines before breakfast with the same quiet thoroughness that Hugh had given the same task for 20 years. He was already as tall as his father, and had his mother's particular way of saying exactly what he thought without apology, which was both useful and occasionally exhausting. Ruth Morgan was 14 and had the horse she had negotiated for at age 4, a gray mare she had named specifically to annoy her brother, and she rode with a confidence that made her parents simultaneously proud and anxious. In the autumn of 1898, when the Morgan Ranch had been running for 16 years and had grown to something that people in Clarendon described without qualification as one of the best operations in the county, Hugh and Ida sat on the porch one evening as they had done countless evenings, with coffee, in the particular piece of the place after the work was done. The porch was the same one he had been sitting on when she first rode into the yard. The coffee pot was a different one, the original blue enamelware having finally given up after many years of loyal service. The chairs were the same chairs. James and Ruth were inside, involved in some argument about something that did not require adult intervention, based on the tone, only the opportunity to work it out. The Panhandle evening was doing what it did, going slowly from gold to rose to the deep blue-gray that was the particular beauty of this particular place in the world. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" Ida said. "What?" "The morning I first came here. I was so frightened on the way over. I had rehearsed what I was going to say about 6 times. He looked at her with that steady attention. I could not tell. I was trying very hard not to. You were very composed," he said. "You sat on that horse like you owned the whole Panhandle," she laughed. "I was terrified." "Of what?" "That you would say no and that I would not know what to do after that." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the evening. "I was never going to say no. How could I have known that?" "You could not have," he said, "but it was never a possibility." She looked at him. "Why?" he considered, as he always did, taking the question seriously. "Because you had ridden 4 miles in July heat to ask, which told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person you were. And because there was water enough. And because no good is done by keeping things to yourself when someone else needs them." She thought about that for a long time. "Stay to talk about what else you needed," he said quietly, almost to himself, like he was remembering the morning. "That is what I said." "You did? Did I ever find out?" he asked. "Everything you needed." She looked at him, at this man beside her on the porch of the house that was hers as completely as anything had ever been hers. She thought about the water and the fence posts and the cattle and the letters and the children and the years and the garden and the everything of it, the whole complete built and survived and loved thing of it. "Yes," she said. "You found out and then you provided it, all of it." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had taken it the first time on her porch in October of 1882, simple and sure. "Good," he said. The evening went on. Inside the house, the argument between James and Ruth resolved itself into laughter, which was usually how those things ended. Raphael was still on the property, older now, with a wife named Graciela who had come in 1891 and who had made the bunkhouse into an actual home. Tomas had moved to Amarillo and started a livery business and sent letters at Christmas. The cattle were healthy. The garden was put to bed for the season. The well was full. Hattie Boone had died peacefully in 1895 at a considerable age, and they had buried her in the Clarendon Cemetery, and missed her with the specific grief you have for people who have known you for a long time and seen you clearly. But the Sunday suppers went on. because habit and hospitality were things worth keeping. And now the neighbors who came were different ones. Newer families, younger people who were doing what Ida and Hugh had done 15 years ago, which was arriving in this enormous landscape and trying to make something real in it. Ida sat on the porch of the Morgan house in the October evening of 1898 and held her husband's hand and listened to her children laughing inside and felt the peace of the place settle around her like something that had always been there and that she had finally learned to rest inside. She had come here with an empty canteen and a prepared speech and a heart that was doing its best after considerable loss. She had asked for water. She had gotten everything. The stars appeared, one by one, over the Texas Panhandle, in the particular abundance that the flat, open country allows for, with no hills or trees to interrupt the sky's intentions. They spread overhead in their thousands, the same stars that had been over this land forever, over every person who had ever stood on it and looked up, and they would be there long after, unchanged, indifferent, and beautiful. Hugh Morgan looked up at them, and then at his wife beside him and said nothing, because there was nothing needed. Everything that needed to be said had been said, over the years and the seasons and the mornings and the evenings and the hard things and the good ones, and what remained was this: the two of them on the porch, the land around them, the life they had made from a morning when a woman rode up on a tired horse and asked for water, and a man said yes, and then said stay. She stayed, and it was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough.